Okay, welcome everyone to the Biomass webinar series. We're delighted today to have Dr. Nicholas Boersma join us to tell us about the long-term assessment of Miscanthus productivity and sustainability project, one that's near and dear to my heart. But before we get to that, Nick, would you mind advancing your slides and I'll do our normal thank yous for our sponsors? So this webinar series is brought to us by collaborations from the Department of Energy, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Iowa State University, the University of Illinois, and several institutes associated with the University of Illinois, as well as private foundation funding. Please feel free to share the QR code with any of your friends. We do anticipate that this series will continue again starting in the fall. You can go ahead and skip to the next slide.
I think I
Oh, sorry.
omitted the
Okay,
next
so
one. Sorry. It's
that's all right.
Nick's
So
next.
thank you. So Nictor, Dr. Nictor Namois will be joining us next week to tell us about other perennial crop dynamics. But just a quick heads up about what to expect with the webinar series going forward. We have a slight change in the schedule on March 6th. Stephen Croxton is going to delay his presentation until we reconvene later in the year. And instead, we will hear Peter Wolf talking about miscanthus production and use around Ashtabula, Ohio. So that might be a place some of us have heard about particularly with regard to packaging and pet food products, I think. So we'll learn more about that. And thanks to Steve Schomburg for helping to facilitate a conversation about when to start back up. So I think what we're going to do is after the March presentations, we will reconvene after planting. So probably sometime in July, we might kick back up, or we could postpone until the fall if there's strong feelings that we should just delay over the summer. There are probably 6 or 7 speakers that I have lined up on deck. So if you have strong feelings about when we should start back up, please reach out to me or put it in the chat and I'll see it eventually. But otherwise, we will plan to start back up after spring break, just not yet sure on the timing. Okay. Thank you very much and take it away, Nick.
All right. Well, thank you. I had practiced thanking everyone as well, so now I don't have to do that. So I'll just thank especially Emily Heaton and Anya for organizing this webinar, and especially I'm honored to have been invited as a speaker. I've found all the information so far extremely interesting, and hopefully I can maintain that momentum with this talk today. So as Emily said, I'm going to be talking about the LAMPS experiment at Iowa State, the long-term assessment of miscanthus productivity and sustainability. And I just want to highlight when I'm talking about miscanthus today, in coordination with what Eric Sachs said last week. We're specifically talking about Miscanthus giganteus or giganteus, depending on your pronunciation preference. The triploid sterile hybrid of Miscanthus sacroflorus and sinensis. So I want to be specific about that because there are a lot of Miscanthus species out there and some new types that are coming online. So I just want to be clear about what we're talking about. So anytime I say Miscanthus, it's giganteus is what I'm referring to. So what I'm going to be talking about today is I'm going to give a little bit of a story about how the LAMPS project started, the genesis of LAMPS, if you will. We'll talk about what we did at the LAMPS experiment, the things we learned at the experiment, and then I'm going to go through a little bit about where I think we can take the research, knowing what we know now and what we've learned from LAMPS for the next phase. So before I do any of that, though, I just want to highlight the things I want you to remember just to kind of prime your mind, if you will, to have an idea if you agree with these statements that I make today. So the 3 things I'm going to be highlighting today is the fact that at the LAMPS experiment, we saw different nitrogen response by site. And that ranged from either no response to very little amount of nitrogen required to get a good yield response. All of the N treatments that we looked at had a similar aging pattern, And don't worry if this doesn't make a whole lot of sense now, because I'll obviously go through it in a little more detail shortly. And then finally, this is kind of a new concept that we're developing and working up a manuscript to talk about in more detail as well. But we're proposing that the aging of Miscanthus can be essentially categorized into four distinct phases. And this is going to be a little bit more abstract in the description during the talk, but I think it's an interesting way to think about Miscanthus aging moving forward, especially when we start talking about potential yield declines. So, how did we get started with lamps? And I put "we" in quotes because in reality, this really all started with the University of Iowa in 2010, at least the lamps experiment did for anyway. In 2010, the University of Iowa president at the time was Sally Mason, and she announced some very ambitious sustainability goals, one of which was to be 40% renewable on their campus by 2020. This was pretty ambitious, like I said, because at around that time they were only around 6% by their estimation. So they took that really seriously. It wasn't just a PR stunt or lip service. They really took it seriously, as many of you are on the call know firsthand. But what they identified was that a good way to get to their renewable goals was to add miscanthus or MXG as a feedstock to offset coal usage in their power plant. Once they decided miscanthus should be part of their energy portfolio, that quickly led them to Emily Heaton, obviously. And at that time, she had already started at Iowa State. I was her PhD student, just finishing my PhD around that time. So I got pulled in to work on lamps as well. And around 2014, the timing might be a little bit off here, but um, from the pictures I have, the real earnest planting, the commercial planting at UI started around 2014, spring 2014. So that kind of brings us up until to the beginning of lamps, which started in 2015. So throughout this process, Emily could attest to this as well. Some of our early meetings in Iowa City, we kind of got the impression that, University of Iowa is pretty awesome, right? And I am a diehard Cyclones fan. If you know me at all, I bleed Cardinal and gold. So I was particularly dismayed that, from my perspective, it really seemed like the Hawkeyes were laying the smackdown on us on the agricultural front on our own turf and on my turf specifically because they were doing it with Miscanthus, which I had just done my PhD for the last 5 years. So our thinking was, we got to do something here, and I had a little cry about the, feeling so much admiration for the Hawkeyes, but we really wanted to contribute and help the project forward and to do our due diligence and helping the research of Miscanthus go forward. So we wrote a couple grants early in 2014, late 2014 to the Iowa Energy Center and the Leopold Center to establish the LAMPS experiment. Again, the main goal of the whole project was to answer the questions that farmers needed to know as we were ramping up commercial operations. And speaking of commercial operations, I feel like the markets have been recently expanding as well. We're getting pretty regular inquiries at Iowa State. I know Emily does too, about how to grow miscanthus and things of that nature. And one thing I'll note is early in the project of lamps, we had a pretty thriving extension program facility in Emily's program. But as she has moved to University of Illinois, we don't have quite the extension presence in this space at Iowa State right now. And especially, like I said, given the market expansion, if you guys feel like it would be beneficial for Iowa State to have more of an extension presence, and you find the information today interesting, I would encourage you to reach out to Iowa State and to the dean of the College of Ag and let them know it might be pretty awesome to revamp the extension and outreach around perennial crops at Iowa State again. So that's just my little soapbox moment. So I'll get back to lamps, what I actually know about, okay? At the core of lamps, it's essentially an aging and nitrogen rate trial. Like I said, the biggest goal of lamps has always been to serve farmers and stakeholders. And at the time when we were starting lamps, the biggest questions were, how long is Miscanthus going to live? Does it need nitrogen? And how much? So we designed an experiment to answer those questions. We did it at 3 locations across Iowa: the northwest site, the central site, and the southeast site. The southeast location is located approximately 30 miles or 30 minutes south of Iowa City. So all of these locations are actually turning out to be kind of strategic, honestly. So that's pretty convenient. We looked at 5 different nitrogen rates, ranging from 0 to 400 pounds of N per acre. And the reason we went so high is because we had concerns that maybe some of the trials that weren't seeing a nitrogen response were just not putting enough on. So we wanted to be very thorough and make sure that there was no question that we'd applied enough nitrogen, and I really don't think that's a problem here. The biggest thing you need to remember about lamps, and I'm not going to go into too much detail about this because otherwise I'm going to run out of time and confuse myself and you. But lamps was established as a staggered start experiment. And what that means is, in a common design and a common site, we planted Miscanthus 3 years in a row, in 2015, 2016, and 2017. What that allows us to do, and the data I present here are independently considering age from weather. So one issue with early Miscanthus experiments was, if you had a couple bad years, it looks like yields were going down, maybe because it was getting old. In lamps, we have overcome that by using a staggered start experiment. So that is the unique feature of lamps, that is special to our experiment. So we measured a lot of stuff over the last 10 years. Like I said, we started in 2015. So we've been doing lamps now for about 10 years. We have measured a lot of things over the year, but today I'm going to be talking only about our biomass data. It is the most consistent data set we have. One thing again to note though is all of the information I present today, all the yield information, is hand harvested biomass. So you have to take it with a bit of a grain of salt. We know in commercial fields we get large sectors potentially of areas that are underproductive or maybe even completely missing. But we really wanted to focus on the potential of our treatments. So we focused on a plant scale performance. So you got to take the absolute numbers are kind of, there's the caveat that they were hand harvested yields. So what did we learn? I talked about this once before, or I mentioned most of these things already, but I'm going to start with the fact that what we saw was a site-specific nitrogen response in terms of Miscanthus biomass production. That ranged, like I said, from 2 of the locations showing no response whatsoever to nitrogen application from 0 to 400 pounds, or at the central location, which was nitrogen responsive, it only took our lowest N rate, which was 100 pounds, to recover the yield decline from compared to the 0N. So what does that look like graphically? This is averaged over our entire experiment. On the x-axis, we have our 5 nitrogen rates, 0 through 400. Don't worry about the kilograms there. If you prefer the US units, just take off the 2 digits at the end and it's the same for pounds per acre. But what you'll notice is, and I said this was a site-specific response, so you might be wondering why I've averaged over all the sites. But what I wanted to emphasize was, again, when there was a nitrogen response, the lowest N rate was enough to basically recover all of the yield. So on the y-axis, we have the biomass. Here we've plotted it as megagrams per hectare, but I'm going to provide a US unit tons per acre to kind of keep us on level footing across most of these figures. And I personally can wrap my mind around tons per acre still, even now, better than I can megagrams per hectare. So our overall average for the experiment over the last 10 years is pretty darn close to 7.5 tons an acre, pretty consistently as well, as you'll see. So this is actually the same graph. The last graph is a bit misleading because I had zoomed way in to look at it. This is the exact same graph, but what I wanted to show here again was the 100 pounds was enough to recover the yield. But the overall gain that we received, again, remember this is averaging across all the sites, was only, 1 or 2 megagrams per hectare. So it wasn't a huge response. It was significant, but it was also at only one site. So here, as I said, it was a site-specific response. So now what we're looking at is all three of our locations plotted independently. You can see the green line is our central Iowa location. This is the N-responsive site. The other two locations, northwest and southeast, are pretty much flat lines. Again, everything is kind of coasting. Once we get over the 0N at the central location, everything is kind of, honing in on that 7.5 tons or 15 megagrams, a little over 15 megagrams per hectare over the last 10 years. So pictures are worth 1,000 words, I think the phrase says. So these are two aerial images from Google Earth of two of our locations. The central location is the nitrogen responsive site. You can pick out every single 0N band across the entire field, which is also true when you're at these locations. You can walk across the plots and very easily point to every single 0N without any flags, no map. You can very clearly see them. Whereas at southeast or northwest, while we have maybe some subtle banding in the aerial imagery, when you're next to these plots, you cannot, without the flags, tell which is a 0N or a 400. They all look alike, and our data reflect that as well. So moving on to looking at the effect of time and age, I'm going to talk about it in terms of the nitrogen first. So what we noticed was that all of the nitrogen rates that we looked at followed the same aging pattern. And that's hard to show in a picture, so I'll be showing a couple graphs here shortly. But essentially, the take home from that, our interpretation of a similar aging pattern for all N rates is that nitrogen alone is not solely responsible for biomass decline with time. And hopefully I can demonstrate that with some of these graphs. So on this graph now, we are looking at the stand age on the x-axis. So like I said, we've been doing lamps now for 10 years. Keep in mind this 10 and the 9 and 10, because of the nature of the staggered start, are a little less replicated in our experiments. So you have to take them a little bit with a grain of salt. But the overall pattern that we're seeing over the last 10 years is very similar between all of the N rates. This is averaged over all the locations because it's easier to see the pattern this way. But even the 0N that is subtly lower than the other N rates is still following the same overall pattern. If nitrogen was driving yield decline over time with age, I would expect the 0N line to look completely different than all of the other nitrogen lines, but they all look the same. So our interpretation over the last 10 years at lamps is that this aging pattern is not being driven by nitrogen availability in our plots. Again, here's our 7.5 ton line that over time, especially when you average across all the N rates and locations, our overall average is skirting pretty close to that 7.5 tons or just above 15 megagrams per hectare. It gets a little messier every time you add more data. That's why I don't like to do it that much for presentations, especially. But the one thing I really wanted to note here, remember, Central Iowa is our very nitrogen responsive site, which you can see the 0N line, which is the salmon colored line, is quite a bit lower than the other lines. But even at the most nitrogen responsive site, we see nearly the exact same aging pattern. Again, remember our year 10 has to be taken a little bit with a grain of salt, and I'm pretty confident we might have a little bit of an outlier going on down here in the 300N at Southeast. I just plotted these data like a week ago, so we're still in the process of ironing out and prepping this for the manuscript that we're going to be putting out soon. But the fact remains that the 0N follows the same aging pattern as the rest of the plots, although slightly shifted down at the central location. Again, here's our 7.5 ton benchmark to keep things sort of in perspective as we look at all these different graphs. So now I want to move into, oh goodness gracious, oh no, I forgot to reset the time. Ah, shoot. I'm probably gonna be a little bit long. Apologies ahead of time. I'm gonna move into just the strict aging discussion now. And this is a little bit more abstract because one thing I've noticed as I've looked at the age pattern over time is it's reminiscent of a situation from that I've encountered in population ecology where a population of animals or critters have exceeded the carrying capacity of their environment. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in the next slide or two. So the thing I want you to remember about the aging and what we are proposing moving forward is there are 4 growth phases for Miscanthus development over time. The first 2 phases are pretty well established and probably not going to be hearing too many arguments about those. They're pretty well established, these phases, no pun intended. The first phase is the establishment phase, usually 1 or 2, maybe 3 years, depending on the success of your establishment. For us at Lamps, the establishment phase was approximately 2 years. The next phase is pretty well documented as well and accepted, I would say, at this point, that being peak yields, which usually happens around year 3 or year 4. For us at Lamps, we had a pretty good establishment overall. Peak yield happened around year 3. The next phase is a little bit more contentious, potentially, as is the next, but following the peak yield, you see a bit more of a steady or steep decline. And this is driven a lot by how high your peak yield was initially. So if you imagine peak yield being a little bit higher, you can imagine this declining phase being a little more apparent. So in some of the locations where we didn't get to as high of a peak yield, this declining phase isn't necessarily as obvious. And it's mostly driven by the difference of this peak yield and what I'm calling the stabilization yield or carrying capacity. As you'll see in the next slide or two, I'm thinking about trying to refer to it as carrying capacity. So again, remember, we've been seeing a lot of our plots sort of settling in around this 7.5 ton per acre level, which I'm going to try to convince you is sort of our carrying capacity at these sites. And if you imagine peak yield being a little bit higher as it fell down closer to the stabilization or peak yield level, you would see a bit more steep decline in the years 4 through 6. So I want to talk a little bit more about carrying capacity. I hope I'm not too far over. I have no idea where I'm at because I forgot to reset the time. But when I was plotting these data, the age data, it looked really familiar to me. So my background is in ecology. I did my undergraduate in ecology, and I was like, I feel like I've seen this graph before. It looked really familiar. So I dug out one of my textbooks. I found this graph in one of my textbooks, which is an example of a situation where reproductive rate is so fast that the number of individuals in a population can overcome or be higher than the carrying capacity. So what carrying capacity is essentially the amount of individuals that can be supported in a given environment based on limiting resources. So when reproductive rates are exceptionally high, you can actually produce more individuals than can be sustained, and you'll have a die-off, which is why you see a sort of a reduction. So in this case, we're looking at eggs and baby fish that are hatching from these eggs. But you could also think about this as essentially the number of parents that are laying these eggs. So there's more parents, more eggs, and the result of the baby fish. So you might be asking yourself, and we've kind of gotten to a pretty abstract place when it comes to Miscanthus. But I would argue fish and Miscanthus are maybe more similar than you might think. And I actually have more trophy roots and rhizomes in my camera roll than I have fish. And to be honest, when I'm out there posing with a huge rhizome that I've dug up, it feels a lot like I'm on a fishing trip. It's pretty exciting. So I think the comparison of fish to Miscanthus isn't as much of a stretch as I initially thought. And if you try to take that analogy just a little further, if you'll let me do that, if you think about parents and offspring, you can think of the parents of Miscanthus being the rhizome system. The rhizome system is what's there every single year. Uh, and the offspring, if you will, are the annual production of stems and leaves that are produced every year, which is the amount of biomass that is produced on an annual basis. In this case, for the fish example, the carrying capacity was around 200, and you can see we overshot carrying capacity, and eventually there's a recovery period where you start approaching carrying capacity in the population. So to me, it looks pretty similar to our yield numbers over time, especially if we had peak yields that were slightly higher. I feel like these curves would look very similar. And the important part to note about this is the overshooting carrying capacity and the die-off happens because there's limited resources in the environment. So some resources becoming limiting, leading to a decline, in our case, of biomass, or in the fish, of the number of fish that are present in the population. So what's next? Given what we've learned at LAMPS, we're going to continue harvesting biomass. We're going to probably do an adjustment to the nitrogen rates because clearly we're applying way more than we need to. So next phase, we're going to address that. But the thing I'm most interested in is trying to figure out what is driving this stability yield or carrying capacity for Miscanthus. What is becoming limiting over time? Because to me, and what our data suggests is it's probably not nitrogen. So what other things could we be looking at? The two things that we're mostly interested in right now is the amount of space below ground for the Miscanthus as it develops and the below ground growth rate as well. So if you think about planting a brand new crop of Miscanthus, it spends the first few years rapidly developing a below ground root system and rhizome system. Once that root and rhizome system is built, it's not rebuilding it every single year. So the below ground growth rate starts to slow. So something I'm interested in is if this below ground situation is what is driving our long-term yields. And the way we can address that is we need to do a lot more below ground work. We haven't done a lot of it because it's very difficult. If we use equipment, it can make it a little bit easier, but it's something I think we really need to focus on a research front moving forward. So a couple treatments we can use to address that is vertical tillage. This is something we're going to be looking at hopefully this coming spring. This has been done. There's not much information in the literature about doing this. The one paper I could find mentioned having some difficulties trying to do this in a commercial setting. And I'll just leave you with the quote that one of the concluding quotes was, combined, these factors made isolating the impact of tillage on yields difficult and highlights challenges of making real-world observations under commercial operations. I thought that was interesting because they had some issues being able to get the data that they needed just because of the nature of the operation. So I think that really is interesting because it highlights the need for both university research and on-farm commercial activities and research, and sort of the iterative and cooperative process that we need to take advantage of to move this industry forward. So with that, I'll address any questions. Hopefully I didn't go too long, and I thank you for listening. Thank you. Look at the chat.
Nick,
Yeah.
Steve, just two comments. One, I think it's Beck's Hybrids has a research facility where they show corn roots growing.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Something like that. If you could get some kind of piece to set up so you could monitor the root growing over multiple years.
Yeah, and it's pretty recently that I've come to this conclusion that everything I need to do is below ground. So I know University of Illinois has done a lot. Emily would know more. They've installed a lot of ingrowth cores to try to look at root development below ground. I think one challenge, and I've asked the people that are working in that space, um, a big part of the below ground story for Miscanthus is the rhizome system, and they're big compared to roots, right? So a lot of the work that's done in the root space that I'm aware of focuses more on the roots, and it's harder to visualize and make estimations about the rhizomes. So I think we need to look into adapting the methodology that's out there. There should be a good place to start from University of Illinois' work. But I'm interested in what you said about the underground observation because I'm working on a project right now to get a larger scale plantation. And one thing I've proposed doing at this site is basically a root observatory. So like almost like a cellar that you literally walk down below ground with a big window and look at what's happening below ground. I think that'd be really interesting and impactful. So thanks for saying that.
Eric, Run here.
Hey,
Hey, um, when you say uh, your harvest data was by the plant, is that correct?
yeah,
And
yep. Well, you could think of it that way. You can't really
so,
distinguish between plants. We did it on a quadrat basis, but it's sort of at a plant scale.
I want to understand this. So if you had 10 square feet, as the years progressed, you'd have more plants per in that 10 square feet, correct?
Yeah, yeah, you should, yeah.
And that didn't affect the nitrogen needs or the nitrogen pickup. Did you, are you accounting for that? How does that work?
So our harvest was on an area basis. So we did quadrat harvest. So we took 1 to 2 square meters for every single plot. We had 60 plots. The quadrat was randomly placed. So we should have been accounting for the way we did things should account for increased tillers over time. But again, like I said, the bigger your sample area, the better you're going to be able to characterize the tiller exploration and expansion. So on a meter square basis, we're accounting for, you know, tiller increase over time to an extent, not as well as we could have if we harvested the entire plot. Um, but for hand harvesting, um, that was about as good as we could do logistically with 60 plots. Um, so yeah, we've harvested thousands of square meters over the years from these plots by hand. But it's never going to be as good as, harvesting an entire plot, which is where we're hopefully going to be going next with bigger plots.
Yeah.
So, yep,
Um, well, what I'm getting at is we planted our miscanthus about 18 years ago now. And back then you planted it every square meter
yep,
because there weren't many rhizomes.
right,
And so over the years, I mean, a lot of years, that has filled in,
yep,
and that makes all the difference
right,
in
yep,
yield.
yep,
So I'm just wondering what happened to your actual population over time,
yeah,
and did you graph that along with the nitrogen use?
yeah.
And
So,
go
oh,
ahead.
so one thing I should say is our planting methodology. We utilized I should go back. I'm going to go back to the picture. So we used Agrotech's plot planter. So our
Yeah.
planting density started really high, especially compared to the
Oh,
early research.
yeah.
Um, and I think that's part of the reason, like this aging pattern. When you see some of the aging patterns of older European stuff, it doesn't increase in yield as quickly, right?
Mm-hmm.
So uh, I think when we have increased the planting density to where we have and what some of the modeling suggests is that increasing planting density gets us to peak yield a lot faster. So as we're sampling out in year 4, year 5, year 6, this is kind of what I was alluding to with the below ground growth rate. We're already to the point where uh, we're not actually adding any tillers anymore. Like there's no more space left. We're planting 4 to 8 times higher than we did when I started my PhD. So when I started my PhD, it was maybe 10 to 20,000 rhizomes per hectare. And
Right.
now in our commercial fields and at Lamps, which was designed to mimic the commercial planter, we're 8 times that rate, like at 80,000.
Right.
So I think what's happening is we're reaching peak yield a lot faster. And with that, we're actually seeing this declining phase happen faster earlier too, because the plant is out of space. There's no more room. We've planted it so densely, which is good from a establishment perspective because it makes it a lot more durable and tougher when there's more stems and material early right away. But it runs out of space. So I think something we need to do, really do, this is really important, I think, moving forward. We need to do some planting density studies to look at the impact of planting density on the shape of this aging curve.
Is that why you pulled that vertical tillage tool through there? Are you trying to thin it out or what?
Yep.
I never heard the reasoning to
Right.
do that.
Yeah, and I kind of sped through that part because I felt like I was running out of time. So our hypothesis is essentially Miscanthus has run out of space or is running out of space below ground. So the vertical tillage tool, the idea with the vertical tillage is it's going to cut up some of the dead material that's down there that might be in the way, create some physical space for the rhizomes that are living to expand into, which should hopefully stimulate more above ground growth. Because if the plant is saying, "Yo, I'm developing more material down here. I'm going to need some more resources down here to support this new growth," the chances that it's going to be producing more above ground material to meet that demand, that would kind of be the hypothesis behind it. That
Okay, well,
the plant is wanting to, you know,
yeah.
my hypothesis. I want to be careful about saying we because I'm not sure if everyone agrees with me, but my hypothesis is essentially uh, rhizomatous growth for grasses is basically a colonization strategy. It's a way that it can take up space. And in our plots, when we've planted so densely, as the rhizomes are creeping out to explore the environment and it's bumping into all its friends, it's to the point where there's no more reason to grow down here. We've already colonized this whole area. We own this place. So, um, I think if you go in with some vertical tillage and, show it who's boss and remind it that there might be some more space down there, it could stimulate some above ground growth. And I think I went really quickly through that European trial, but they did see good, anecdotally anyway, some pretty good response from the vertical tillage. So we have some good anecdotal, and I know Agritech is doing it a bit as well. Haven't gotten a lot of details on how it's worked out for them so far, but we have some pretty good anecdotal evidence that vertical tillage could be beneficial to reestablishing or recovering some of the yield decline from aging miscanthus.
Just one more comment. We did the vertical tillage like 3 years ago,
Uh-huh.
but the object was to try to fill in the spaces that were missing.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
And there were some, I didn't take any measurements, but visibly it did fill in those spaces. It's kind of the opposite of what you're doing to
Yeah.
kind of thin it out. Well, this was
Right.
trying to thicken it up.
Right.
So I don't, just a comment there.
Yeah, yeah. I
We need
think
some data is what we need.
Oh, absolutely. And unfortunately, like the below ground stuff is the hardest thing I've been a part of as far as miscanthus research, but it's what we really need to do. I don't see a way around it. We're gonna have to be digging up plants pretty regularly, so we're gonna have to figure out the best way to do it efficiently and accurately. But as far as the dead, the empty spaces like you see in that was part of the reason they did the tillage as well. One thing that I would wonder about is if in some of these dead, empty spaces, if there's dead material below ground, the thing about all miscanthus tissue is that it doesn't break down very quickly. If you've been in a miscanthus field, you see the litter layer. You can paw through the litter layer and find, layer after layer after, like it takes quite a while to break down. And I think the rhizomes do as well. And I think sometimes there's just the physical space is being occupied, maybe even by dead material below ground. So breaking that apart and creating some space, even in the bare spots, I think can be helpful. And then the other thing that tillage does, and this is going to go back to my physiology nerdiness. Also a plant physiologist, but when you wound a plant, which is what this vertical tillage would be doing, it stimulates growth. So a wounding response for most plants is to grow, to try to overcome the wound. So I think that could be another stimulating effect, why we might see additional growth below ground. Oh, Mike's on here. Mike could tell me. And Heather said the ingrowth cores come out of the ground April 26th. Can you guys, Mike or Heather, can you talk about potentially the ingrowth cores, like the potential of using the ingrowth cores to look at the actual rhizomes? Because the way I understood, I'm not completely understanding how the ingrowth cores work, but it seemed like it was more about the root tissue than the rhizomes. So I was just curious if either type it in the chat or just
Yeah,
mention.
I'd be happy to go into that, Nick. Before I do though, I was just curious, do you intend to do this vertical tillage in any eddy covariance plots? I
Yeah,
was just
so
thinking it
that's
would be cool to get the carbon footprint of that
yeah,
too.
and that was the focus of this paper that's on the screen right now mostly. They had an eddy plot. Um, I really want to do that. We've talked about potentially doing it at one of the Illinois plots, at least at some point down the road. I think what we're going to end up doing, we're going to do it potentially in the lambs plots this year. We have one other set of plots that we're doing a P and K trial that we might combine the tillage in as well. We're still deciding how to do it. And I think if we see good results in the lambs trial, we'll scale it up. That's the nice thing with our system right now. We have plots on various scales. So we have plots that are 200 feet by 80 feet. We have plots that are 600 feet by 80 feet, 4.5 acres. And we have a couple plots that are, 5 to 9 acres in scale. So I think if we see good results in the smaller plots from the vertical tillage, which we're going to be doing it this spring. I just bought literally the PO just went out this week. So we'll have that tiller on our yard within the next 2 weeks, I would assume. So that's going to be happening this spring in some of our plots, and if we get good results, we'll scale it up. And the Sabre plot, the 9-acre plot, has an eddy tower, so we'd be able to quantify that. And then hopefully it'd be great if there's interest in Illinois. I think we're still deciding to do it in one of the Miscanthus eddy plots there as well, to have coupled measurements.
Yeah, I'd love to continue that conversation. We have a number of, I think, destructive type regeneration experiments planned for the near future, but I'm not sure
Yeah, that'd be
what
really
the
cool.
status of all of them is and where they intend to be. But
Right.
so in
Might
regard
be-
to the ingrowth cores, so we
Yeah.
designed that experiment at the energy farm and in 3 of the agritech commercial sites around Iowa City.
Mm-hmm.
And the goal was to sort of assess the spatial variability above and below ground. So we
Mhm.
identified using remote sensing some areas of high, medium, and low growth in those plots, and then we added the ingrowth cores to see if what we saw above ground was matched below ground. But you're absolutely right in that it's really not going to assess any rhizome growth. So you can
Okay.
picture those as sort of tubes that get put in the ground with holes in them, and so then we allow the roots to grow in for a period of time. So in this
Okay.
case, we've chosen 2 years. And then we pull them back out and see what's grown in. So we can assess root growth, but also new root growth, which is important in your context here, right? So,
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, because I think the question is turnover. Like we talk about Miscanthus having, 12 to 15 megagrams or, 5 to 7 tons of below ground biomass, right? But in reality, most likely it built 90% of that biomass in years 1 through 3. And after that point, the only new biomass that's below ground is basically what turns over, right? Like there's not a ton of new growth. And this is again my hypothesis. I don't want to, you know, make it seem like we're in agreement about that, but just from being in a field and planting miscanthus many, many times, this is just what it seems like. It spends the first few years vigorously building a below ground system that is maintained for years. And then after that point, there's not a whole lot of new growth down there. So I think the turnover, like you said, the amount of new roots, new rhizomes is the key, I think, to, understanding a lot of what's going on.
yeah. So the DeLucia lab has been ongoing work for years to try to address this turnover question. So I don't think Janeth is on this call, but he's leading that work. So there should hopefully be some pretty cool results coming out.
That's
We were
awesome.
talking about imaging at one point before,
Yeah.
and so they're using mini rhizotron images, which is essentially a camera that you can stick down a tube into the soil to take pictures of the roots over time.
Yeah, that'd be
Uh,
awesome.
and so it's kind of interesting because we had a lot of success with this at the energy farm during an establishment. So during the first, say, 5 or 6 years of planting there, and then we kind of abandoned that work, and we were sort of like, well, we've in a way sort of learned all we need to know about that kind of stuff. But
Hmm.
in retrospect of some of your aging graphs, it was probably a poor time to actually discontinue some of that imaging, although it is really labor intensive. But um, yeah, so hopefully, not too long in the future, we'll be able to answer some of those turnover questions.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think that that was another point I was going to maybe try to be on my soapbox about, with in terms of like the university research and perennial research in general, because for us to understand how these things work over time takes time. It's a lot different than, some of the microbiology stuff that happens, or if you're using like Arabidopsis or something in basic plant research. It's a lot harder with a perennial crop because if you want to know what it does for 10 years, you need to watch it for 10 years, and we can try to model it, but you know, the models are only as good as the data that have been fed into them. So, it's like I said, this is going to be an iterative process with cooperation with our uh, commercial partners to really make progress, I feel like. But the key is like the long-term measurements are key, in my opinion.
When you
Oh, sorry.
when,
Go ahead.
when you do these village trials, will you? I would hope you try to measure how deep you're going to
Yep.
kind of determine how much of the rhizome you're destroying.
Right.
To know that would be helpful because I had no idea how deep to run the tillage tools when I did it. It was just kind of, I guess, by golly.
Yeah.
And then one last question: did you look at P and K? You looked at N, but did you look at P and K in any of this?
So in this experiment, we didn't do any P and K. We were focused completely on the nitrogen in this
Okay.
experiment. We're starting one. We have a grad student, Ashton Larson, here at Iowa State, that's started a P and K trial, a year and a half ago or so now at this point. So we're getting into the P and K now. I think Lamps has showed us that, I think probably what's going on with like the aging process, like the big changes in yield are probably being driven by age, or, whatever is driving the age process. And then the
Yeah.
subtle variability, the waviness that we see, I think that's being driven probably by nutrient availability and weather, over time. But P and K is really an interesting one. And another one too that people have been asking about is sulfur. So in the near future, like it's kind of shocking, we haven't done is enough of the basic agronomy experiments, like the planting density trial I mentioned, even planting timing. We know we want to plant as early as we can, but we don't really have a good handle on, how crucial that is, at least from a quantitative perspective. So I mean, I think that's really the cool thing with Miscanthus is we have a lot of experiments we can do. Like I'm never bored, ever. Like
Yeah,
it's the opposite. I have a hard time focusing on one thing, to be honest. So,
yeah,
um, if we can get a steady state flow of financial support to, like we could build a army of a team to address so many different things, as we move forward. But it all depends on the markets. If there's a demand,
right,
if there's a demand to grow it, then we'll be able to do it.
right.
So hopefully Emily and Travis and others that are working heavily in the market development continue to have success, and I think they've done awesome up to this point for sure. So
Yeah, very good.
Steve asked why the forecasted yields were so high 10 years ago, and I think that does have to do with the hand harvesting. Uh, the smaller the hand harvest you do, the more, I mean, hand harvests are notorious for overestimating yield. The one thing I will say about our methodology that we used in lambs, um, there's different cutting heights, right? And Brian Peterson in our group has quantified the effect of cutting height on harvestable yield, and it's pretty impactful. So you don't have to increase cutting height very much to start having a pretty strong impact on the harvestable yield.
Yeah,
So some hand harvesting is done right at the soil surface because they're trying to estimate essentially all of the above ground biomass. What we did, because we were really focused on trying to provide um, as realistic information as we could at the scale we were working, we did a cutting height of closer to 6 or 8 inches. So we are still going to be overestimating probably on our yields because we are focusing on collecting plants and looking at how the plants changed over time. So we didn't put the quadrat down in a bare space, for instance. But our overestimation is maybe less egregious than has been in the past. And also using a full square meter, which is a lot of biomass at the end of the day. It's a lot of material to handle actually, is different than, other trials have used smaller quadrats, which could be even more prone to overestimating yields. And I think that's potentially, and finally, where you were measuring yields made a difference. So some of the early stuff, if you had a 2 or year 3 project, and you reported the yields, you're like, oh dang, we're gonna be pumping out 25, 30 megagrams a hectare. Well, you were also measuring at peak, right? Like, so I think all of those things come into play, and these long-term data sets, I think it highlights why they're so important to maintain these trials long term.
yeah,
Does that answer the question?
Yeah, this is something I've thought a lot about too, Nick, and something that we see all the time in essentially overestimating based on hand harvests. And I
Yeah.
think it's all those things that you just mentioned and more,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, I mean, when you're hand harvesting, you literally collect every gram,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
you have no
Right.
no machine loss essentially.
Right.
And I think it's fairly low in some of these things, but it's not
Not
nothing.
zero.
It's not nothing. Plus, you already mentioned the spatial variability, right? So
Right.
you're scaling a small area over a very large area and not accounting for all the patchy areas and
Right. Right.
and as researchers we do our best to avoid that bias, but it's so hard to so much
yeah,
riding on your experiment to actually effectively account for all that empty space in the small area is really hard. So,
I think it's important to be upfront. That's why I'd kind of glossed over that in the past, and Jacob Stute in our group reminded me the other day. He's like, you got to remember, like, when we're scaling up to a hectare, like we know what we had in that quadrat's not the same as the entire field. So you better be sure to be mentioning the fact that these are hand harvested yields. And I think you can still, especially like the relative effect of our treatments, I think is still really valid with this you know, technique that we used. I think what needs to be the big grain of salt is this, you know, absolute value. One other thing though, this is bone dry yield too. So, you know, from a commercial perspective, when you're harvesting, it's maybe, you know, somewhere between 10 and 15%. So we have that going for us too. Like we're reporting bone dry yields, and what's coming out of the field and the way they're going to be using it is, you know, probably between 10 and 15%. So as far as, you know, raw yields are concerned, it'll be slightly higher. That's another thing we can think about as well. So
Just another comment. You say your harvest height is 6 to 8 inches.
yeah, we tried to, yeah, we tried, and we know, that was set early on where we were under the impression that on a commercial scale, we'd be running the header at around 6 or 8 inches. And now we know like that head is probably closer to 12 or more inches off the
Yeah, I was gonna
ground.
say, that's the
Right,
only way you can go through without it balling up.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so we tried to like instead of, you know, 3 years in where we found out like, oh shit, the commercial guys are running the header a foot off the ground, which we are as well when we clear our plots. We tried to keep it consistent. So
Yeah.
yeah, that's definitely a good point though, Eric. Thank you for saying that.
Yeah.